a priest with secrets, a parish drowning in silence. Sin hides in plain sight. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Let me know in the comments where are you solving this from today? Your messages always bring a smile. Let's uncover the truth. It had rained through the night, not heavily, just enough to turn the gutters into soft streams and leave the stone of the quay or favors darkened like an old coat that had absorbed too many winters. When Chief Inspector Megret arrived at his office that morning, his hat and coat dripped steadily on the worn linoleum floor as he shook them out and hung them by the radiator. The heat hadn't yet come on. He didn't turn on the overhead light. The grey morning that filtered through the large windows was enough. He set his pipe on the desk without lighting it and sat down heavily in his chair. Outside, across the Seine, the towers of Notre Dame were shrouded in mist. There was nothing urgent on his desk. A robbery in Montparnasse, a stabbing after hours in a Pigalle bar. The kind of senseless, drunken violence that left nothing to uncover, only to be processed. His fingers drummed absently against a report as he looked at the calendar. Wednesday. He realized, without much surprise, that he had no appointments and nothing pressing to follow. He could, in theory, go home. Instead, he sat there, still. Janvier poked his head in just after 9. Anything, Chief? Nothing, Megret murmured. He gave a slight smile. That's the problem. Janvier hesitated. There's a man downstairs, says he's from Stash. Father Bellin, I think it was. Megret raised an eyebrow. A priest. Says he doesn't need anything official. Just hoped to speak with someone quietly. You want me to send him away? Megret rose slowly. No, I'll see him. He took his time filling the pipe and lighting it before crossing to the small interview room just off the corridor. He didn't know why, but something in the request, a priest at headquarters, asking for nothing official, caught him. Not curiosity, exactly. More like an itch behind the ribs. Father Bellin was younger than Megret expected. Perhaps 35, perhaps younger if you discounted the way the black cassock and neat, square collar aged a man. His hands were folded tightly in front of him, and he looked as though he'd considered walking out 5 times in the past 10 minutes. He stood quickly when Megret entered. Please, Megret said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. There was no notebook on the table, no pen, no file, just the two of them, and Megret's slow, quiet presence. You didn't want this to be official, Megret said. It wasn't a question. Father Bellin nodded. His eyes were pale and uncertain. It's not my place, and I may be mistaken. I very well might be. I see, Megret waited. The priest exhaled. It's about someone I know. Another priest. From the same parish. Older, Father Clement. I think something's wrong. Megret didn't react. He simply let the silence sit. I don't mean criminal, not that I know of. Only there's something strange. He's not himself, and there's a woman. Still, Megret said nothing. She's been coming every Thursday. For 2 months now. Always in the afternoon, when no one else is around. At first, I thought confession, but she never goes into the confessional. He takes her into the back room. What? Does she look like? Megret asked quietly. 40, perhaps 50, elegant in a provincial sort of way, always in grey or dark blue. Gloves. She doesn't speak to anyone. Yesterday I followed her to the metro. She took the line toward Port de Clichy. Father Bellin lowered his eyes, ashamed. Why come to me? I don't know. It doesn't feel right. That's all, and he's changed. He snaps. He forgets things. He smells of something I can't name, but it isn't the sacristy. There was another silence. Maigret tapped the end of his pipe against the ashtray. You understand, he said finally. I don't make inquiries for feelings. I know. That's why I shouldn't have come. Maigret stood, slowly. You did well to come. He paused, looking at the priest with the faintest furrow in his brow. I might pass by Saint Eustache this afternoon. Nothing official, just to light a candle. Outside, the clouds thickened. The street below was slick with rain. Stood at the window for a long time, watching the slow ballet of umbrellas opening and closing as Parisians crossed the boulevard. He didn't know why he was going, but he would go. It was nearing 4 in the afternoon when Maigret stepped out into the Rue de Rivoli. The sky still low and pewter-coloured. The rain had stopped, though the air carried the smell of wet stone and old wood, like the inside of a cellar. He walked without rush, coat collar turned up, pipe unlit but clenched in the corner of his mouth. Saint Eustache rose before him in its peculiar grandeur, not as elegant as Notre Dame, nor as ancient as Saint-Domingue d'Ypres. It seemed too large for its setting, too heavy for the crooked streets around Les Halles. A church built in pride, he thought, but now worn thin by time and soot. He did not go in immediately. Instead, he walked the perimeter once, slowly, observing. A child kicked a can under the arcades of a shuttered bakery. A man in a dark apron smoked outside a fish stall, sleeves rolled past the elbow. Ordinary lives. Nothing pointed. Nothing said murder. Because there was no murder. Not yet. He stepped inside. The hush was immediate. The heavy doors seemed to swallow the sound of traffic as if it had never existed. The stone interior was dim and cool. The few worshippers scattered like shadows across the pews. A woman lit a candle near a side altar and crossed herself without looking up. Maigret stood at the back for a long while. He removed his hat, let his eyes adjust, and said nothing. It had always struck him how in churches people moved differently, slower, as if watched. He wandered, not aimlessly, though he didn't yet know what he was looking for. Behind the main altar stood a small side corridor, curtained, leading to the sacristy. It was here, presumably, that Father Clement had received the mysterious woman. No confessionals, no prying eyes. Just the two of them and the musty quiet of old religious garments and parish records. A movement in the corner caught his attention. A man in his 60s, rotund, with a soft, heavy face and red-veined cheeks, was lighting a votive. Not for prayer, Maigret felt, but habit. The man glanced at him once, then looked away. When Maigret finally moved toward the nave again, he did so slowly, giving time for someone to approach him if they wished. No one did. He found a bench and sat, watching. That was what he did, after all. After 10 minutes, he heard footsteps and turned to see a figure moving down the aisle. A priest, older, but not as old as Maigret had imagined. Clean-shaven, his hair thick and neatly combed back, dark robes pressed. He moved precisely, almost like an actor playing the role of a priest rather than someone worn into the role. His eyes passed over Maigret once, not unkindly, but without pause. It was him. He didn't need to ask. Father Clement passed into the side corridor and disappeared through a wooden door. Maigret remained seated. He reached into his coat, took out his pipe again, and then, remembering, didn't light it. He didn't like churches, though he had nothing against them. It was the solemnity that made him uncomfortable. Too much unsaid. Too many faces carrying burdens no one could name aloud. At 4:10, the door creaked again. This time it was a woman. She entered quickly, her movements neat, restrained. Grey coat, blue scarf tucked under the collar, gloves, no umbrella. Her hair was blonde, or perhaps it had been, and now was simply colorless. She didn't pause to check. She crossed the aisle and went directly toward the same corridor. Maigret watched her go, then stood. He did not follow her, not yet. Instead, he moved toward the far end of the church, where the shadows deepened near a row of confessionals that had not seen use in years. There he stood, half in darkness, as the minutes passed. She didn't come out. 20 minutes, 30, no sound, no voices carrying through the stone, just the weight of the place pressing in. He shifted his stance, unsure what he was hoping for. A confrontation, a glimpse. He wasn't even officially here. If anyone asked, he had merely come to light a candle, perhaps say a prayer. He moved at last, quietly, toward the corridor. The curtain parted easily under his hand. The air beyond was different, warmer, laced with old incense and the sour hint of damp wool. A long, narrow hallway stretched toward the sacristy. He knocked, no answer. He knocked again, this time pushing gently inward. The sacristy was empty. A desk near the window, covered in old service books, a brass crucifix on the wall. A coat hung neatly behind the door. But no one. The door to the rear exit was ajar. He moved to it and looked out into the small cloister garden, overgrown now, with a cracked path and a single stone bench in the center. The woman was there, standing with her back to him, looking at a bird bath filled with stagnant water. Across from her, seated on the bench, was Father Clement. His head was lowered, not in prayer, in weariness. Maigret watched without stepping forward. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the silence between them said more. The woman finally turned, touched the priest's arm gently, almost maternally, and walked away. She did not return the way she came. She passed through a side gate and disappeared into the narrow street beyond. Father Clement remained. On the bench, Maigret waited another minute, then stepped into the garden. The priest did not look up. "I'm not here, officially," Maigret said quietly. "Still nothing. I saw the woman. I don't know who she is, and perhaps it's none of my business." Father Clement lifted his head slowly. There were bags beneath his eyes, deep ones, and a kind of sag to his face that was not simply age. "Then why did you come?" he asked. Maigret shrugged. "Call it an instinct." Father Clement stood. "There's no crime, Inspector. No scandal, no story to print. Is she a parishioner?" A pause. Then she was. "Years ago, you've changed, I'm told. Grown forgetful, short-tempered. Some say distracted." The priest looked at him, and for a moment there was something close to amusement in his eyes. "There are many kinds of confession, Inspector, but not all of them are meant for the box." Maigret said nothing. He turned and looked again at the empty bird bath. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Instead, he left the garden, returning to the street. At the corner, he lit his pipe at last. He wasn't sure what he'd seen, but the weight in his chest had shifted. The first real piece had moved on the board, not by force, but by gravity, and now he was sure of one thing. Something was going to happen. Something had already begun. It was Janvier who tracked her down. The next morning, with rain spitting against the windows and the streets glistening from the early market washdown, Maigret stood beside the stove in his office, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. When Janvier knocked and entered, hat still on his head. "She lives in Batignolles," he said, dropping a small notepad onto the desk. "Rue des Moines, second floor, above a former tailor's shop. Name's Louise Vernet." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Married, widowed. Husband died 3 years ago. Clerk in the post office. No children. She's not employed, lives off a small pension and something else, maybe savings, maybe not. Neighbors describe her as proper and distant." Maigret nodded. "Did you speak to her?" "No, just watched. She left around 4 yesterday, took the metro to Les Hollows, that fits. Same coat, same gloves." Maigret lit his pipe slowly. The same pale smoke filled the room, familiar and grounding. "Any visitors?" "None, according to the concierge. She doesn't talk to anyone. Doesn't go to mass locally either," which the concierge found suspicious enough. Allowed himself the faintest smile. Batignolles was a quiet quartier, respectable, though a little faded around the edges. The sort of place where pensioners kept lace curtains stiff with starch, and neighbors noted who walked with whom, and when at 10 o'clock, Maigret left his office and headed north, catching the metro at Châtelet. He didn't rush. As always, he let the city wash over him, its ordinary rhythm more informative than any dossier. In the train, he shared a car with a florist carrying a large bouquet wrapped in wax paper and a man reading. Yesterday's Le Matin. He didn't speak. He watched. When he reached Rue des Moines, it was quieter than usual. The rain had paused, but a cold wind danced along the gutters, pushing wet leaves into little piles at the corners. The tailor's shop was closed, the sign above it faded to illegibility. A narrow stairway led to the apartments above. He climbed slowly. The second-floor landing smelled of cabbage and linoleum. He knocked. A pause, then the sound of a lock turning. Deliberate, not rushed. The woman who opened the door was, as he remembered, elegant in a worn but well-kept way. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wore a navy cardigan over a pale blouse. The apartment behind her was dim but tidy. "Yes?" she asked. Her voice was calm, neutral. "Madame Vernet," Maigret said, removing his hat. "Chief Inspector." "Maigret, may I come in?" Something flickered across her face. Not surprise, precisely. Something more weary. She stepped back without a word. The apartment was small, as he'd expected. A sitting room with 2 armchairs, a round table with a bowl of apples, a lace doily beneath it. The wallpaper was yellowed in spots. There was a crucifix above the fireplace and a photograph of a man in uniform beside it, presumably her late husband. She gestured toward the chair. "I suppose you've come about, Father Clement." He sat without answering at first. "You've known him some time?" Her eyes remained steady. "Since before the war. I used to live in the 2nd arrondissement. That's how we met. I attended Mass at Saint Eustache, and since then, I moved here after my husband died, but I would still go back sometimes. For peace of mind." Maigret let a silence stretch between them. "You saw him yesterday," he said. "Yes, every Thursday." She nodded. Another silence. The pipe in his pocket felt heavy, but he didn't reach for it. Smoke would have unsettled the room's delicate balance. "Is he in some kind of trouble, Inspector?" Maigret didn't answer directly. "He's changed, according to people who know him. Withdrawn, nervous. That's what drew my attention." She looked down at her folded hands. "He's afraid of what." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She reached instead. for a small cloth on the armrest and began to smooth it, as if the fabric would answer for her. Maigret said nothing. At last, she spoke. There's a man, someone from his past. He's come back. Maigret didn't lean forward. He stayed still, drawing out the moment without force. He's been watching the church, waiting after Mass, not speaking, but always there. Sometimes, near the garden, sometimes at the front steps. It's frightened him. Who is this man? I don't know, she said, but Maigret saw something tighten in her jaw. You do? No, she said. Then, after a beat, more quietly, I knew of him. Years ago, a long time ago, before Father Clement was ordained. The name didn't come. She didn't offer it. Something happened between them. She nodded slowly. Something ended. There was an emotion there Maigret couldn't yet name. Not love, not quite regret. It was as though she carried a memory that was not hers, but one she had guarded all the same. You said he's afraid, but of what? Exposure, harm, I think, she said. He's afraid of being known. Maigret stood. I may come again, he said. She walked him to the door. You won't find anything criminal, Inspector. Nothing you can put in a report. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her hands were folded again, the knuckles tight with tension. She hadn't invited him to stay, nor had she tried to dismiss him. I'm not always looking for crime, he said quietly. Back in the street, the clouds had returned, and with them, a fine drizzle that barely reached the ground but hung in the air like mist. He didn't return to the office. Instead, he wandered the streets of Batignolles, letting the woman's words sift through his thoughts. He's afraid of being known. There had been no mention of blackmail, no sign of violence, and yet something pressed inward. A wait at the corner cafe. He took a table by the window and ordered a beer. He didn't open his notebook. He didn't need to. Something had broken. Long ago, something had never healed, and now it was circling back. When the beer came, he sipped it slowly. Through the rain-slicked window, he watched a boy chase a runaway scarf down the pavement. An old woman argued with a vendor over the price of mushrooms. Life unchanged, but inside the lives of others, of a priest, a widow, a shadow from the past. Something was stirring, quietly, like a storm forming beneath the surface. He would wait. Waiting was what he did best. Maigret spent much of Friday doing nothing, or at least nothing that would have impressed anyone with a badge. He sat at his desk in silence, sipping lukewarm coffee, turning over matchbooks from cafes he hadn't visited in years, and reading half a page at a time of a novel whose name he couldn't recall even while holding it. The rhythm of the office rolled on around him. A pickpocket in the 10th, a domestic dispute in Mentonville. Someone tried to report a missing parrot. It was the usual hum, frustratingly petty, unmistakably human. At noon, Maigret opened the window slightly. The air that came in was cold, and wet and smelled of chimney smoke, but he preferred it to the musty warmth inside. Rain made people more honest, he'd always thought. It dampened the urge to pretend. At 3, Lognon appeared. Inspector Lognon was a man born to frown, a drooping figure whose voice always seemed to carry the bitter chill of disappointment. He was carrying an oilskin folder tucked under his arm, and a faint smirk lingered at the corner of his mouth. That was unusual enough to catch Maigret's eye. You've been sniffing around, Testosh, Lognon said, not sitting. I've been lighting candles, Maigret replied without looking up from his pipe. Some men find peace in prayer, others in being annoying. Lognon ignored the jibe. There was a disturbance there, last night, after Vespers. No one filed a report, so it may be nothing. Maigret looked at him now. And yet you're here. The sacristan found a man, loitering by the garden gate, said he startled Father Clement when he came out. No violence, no threats. The man left before anything could be said. Description. Lognon pulled a page from the folder. Tall, coat too thin for the weather. Grey beard, but not fully grown. Carried a satchel. Didn't speak, just watched. Maigret held out his hand for the sheet, but didn't read it. He already had the shape in his mind. That presence, the one Louise Vanette had hinted at. A ghost from before the priesthood, from before the mask. I suppose it's a waste of time, Lognon added, already turning toward the door. Almost certainly, Maigret said, but the tone of his voice made Lognon pause. You really think this priest is hiding something? Maigret stood and walked to the coat rack. He's not hiding something, he said, buttoning his coat. He's waiting for it. He returned to Santostosh near the end of the afternoon, when the light outside had turned pale, and the church had begun to glow from within, not with artificial light, but with the subdued shimmer of age and stillness. A few candles burned at the side altars. The scent of incense lingered faintly, but it was no longer fresh. He didn't enter right away. Instead, he crossed the street and bought a paper cornet of roasted chestnuts from an old man with red knuckles and a greasy scarf. He stood near the stall, eating slowly, eyes on the church steps. 15 minutes passed, then 20. At 4:30, a man appeared from the side of the square, not from the metro, not from the market, but from the shadows beneath the gallery of the old buildings. Maigret knew at once. He didn't stand out, and yet he didn't belong. His coat was, indeed, too thin. Army surplus, perhaps, patched at the elbows. His shoes had been shined, but they were the wrong kind for this weather. The satchel at his side looked overstuffed, not with books but with something dense and shapeless. The man didn't look at Maigret. He went straight to the side entrance of the church, leaned against the stone column, and lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. He wasn't waiting for Mass. Maigret gave him time. He finished the chestnuts, dusted his fingers on a handkerchief, and crossed the street as if out for an aimless walk. When he neared the column, he stopped and pretended to examine the notice board by the door. Mass times, parish events, a faded leaflet on organ restoration. The man did not move, but he was aware. Maigret could sense it. The sudden, cautious stillness that came when someone knew they were being seen. He turned to face him, waiting for someone. He asked quietly. The man looked up. His eyes were bloodshot but alert, sunken behind thick brows. He took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled with a kind of resigned irritation. I'm not disturbing anyone. No, Maigret said simply. I've a right to be here, of course. A pause. Maigret didn't move. He didn't ask for a name. He didn't show a badge. That wasn't how these things worked. You know him? Maigret asked. The man didn't answer. Father Clement. The man's lip curled slightly, not in amusement, more like pain. Is that what he calls himself now? Maigret nodded slowly. You knew him before. Another silence. Then we were close. There was no defiance in the voice, number, shame, either. Just weariness. You've come to see him. I've seen him, and I don't know. Maigret nodded again. He looked out toward the rain-darkened street, where a woman with a scarf over her hair walked briskly past, eyes down. "What do you want from him?" Maigret asked. The man's hands trembled as he reached into his coat and withdrew the stub of a second cigarette. He didn't light it. He just rolled it between his fingers. "Nothing," he said at last. "I just wanted to know if he remembered, if he still was who he used to be." Maigret turned to look at him again. "And is he?" The man exhaled. Without sound. "He hides better now." Maigret studied him, not unkindly. The man was not dangerous. He could feel it. Not violent, but there was something deeply unsettled in him, a need that hadn't found language yet. "Do you intend to keep coming here?" Maigret asked. "I don't know. I've nowhere else." That was the truth. Maigret could hear it in the tone. He nodded again and took a step back. "If you change your mind," he said, reaching into his coat and handing the man a card, "you can find me." The man took it wordlessly. Maigret didn't expect a call. He turned and walked down the steps into the early dark of the November evening. His coat pulled tight against the wind. Somewhere behind him, the bells of Saint-Eustache began to ring softly, calling no one in particular, just as they always had, and Maigret, walking into the mist, understood that the past had not come back to haunt Father Clement. It had never left. It had simply waited, as all things do, for silence. The next day passed quietly, too quietly. In Maigret's view, there were no calls, no complaints, no dramatic unravelings, just a slow trickle of weather reports on the radio, and the rustle of dossiers being shifted from one desk to another. A weekend mood had begun to settle over the Quai Orfèvres, despite it only being Saturday. The cloud cover remained stubborn and low, and the air inside the office smelled faintly of wet wool and dust. At home, Madame Maigret had made blanquette de veau for lunch. They ate without hurry, Maigret using his fork more like a paddle, pushing the meat through the pale sauce and occasionally glancing out the window at the bare branches scratching against the glass. After coffee, he read a column in Paris and then closed it without turning the page. "You're thinking about the priest," Madame Maigret said simply, from across the room where she was mending one of his shirts. He looked up, not surprised. "Yes, you have that look," she added, "like when you're listening to someone who hasn't spoken yet." He smiled faintly and returned to his chair, pipe between his teeth but unlit. Her remark lingered in the air. She had said it offhandedly, but it struck him as accurate, painfully so. That was exactly it. He was waiting for a voice that hadn't spoken, or perhaps one that no longer knew how. By late afternoon, the streets had begun to thin. The shops closed early in that part of Paris, and only the cafes held light. Maigret returned to Saint-Eustache, not out of obligation, but something heavier, a sense that the thing he was watching unfold had reached a stillness just before motion. Inside the church, the mood had shifted. Fewer candles, the silence more pronounced. Even the air seemed colder, as if something had receded. The priest was not at the altar, nor in the sacristy, as Maigret soon confirmed after a quiet conversation with the sacristan, a nervous man who kept glancing toward the garden gate. "He hasn't been right lately," the sacristan murmured. "Not since that man showed up." "Did he tell you anything?" Maigret asked. The sacristan hesitated. "No, only that he might be taking some time, a retreat, maybe. He said he needed to be alone." "When did he say that?" "Thursday evening, after the man came." So Maigret walked the church again, slowly, listening, near the confessional. He spotted something odd, A window above the old boiler room left slightly ajar. The stained glass had been shifted on its hinge, barely enough to notice unless you were looking for it. He crossed the nave, opened a side door, and circled round to the garden. The gate was unlocked. The garden had changed since his last visit. Not in appearance, but in feeling. The bench was empty. The bird bath had tipped slightly to one side, a fresh crack down its middle. He looked up at the window. From there, you could see the garden clearly. Whoever had opened it hadn't been airing out the sacristy they'd been watching. He returned to the church interior, climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the boiler. It was hardly a room at all, more like a storage space, unused and cold, with old wooden crates stacked against the wall and the scent of mildew in the air. And yet someone had been here. There were 2 cigarette butts on the windowsill. Fresh, not older than a day. A discarded matchbook from a cafe in Montmartre. The dust on the crates had been disturbed. Maigret didn't need more than that. The man had returned, not just to see, but to wait, and to hide. Back at the station, Maigret asked Janvier to find the name. Someone connected to Clement, from before his ordination, possibly from the war, someone who disappeared. Janvier raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. He was good like that. Maigret returned to his office, sat, waited. It was nearly 7 when the call came, not from Janvier, from Louise Vernet. She sounded composed, as ever. But beneath her calm, Maigret heard it. The unmistakable tremor of a woman who has just decided to say something she's kept buried too long. "He's here," she said. "The man, the one you saw. He came to me." "When?" "Just now. He asked to speak. I let him in. He's in the other room." "Is he dangerous?" "No, sad. That's all." Maigret grabbed his coat, gave a brief nod to Janvier, and stepped into the night. Rue des Moines was darker than usual. One of the street lamps had gone out, and the shadows pooled at the corners like spilled ink. Maigret climbed the stairs quietly, noting the smell of cooking from the first floor, onions and something burning slightly. Louise answered the door before he knocked. She looked tired, more so than before. She gestured silently to the sitting room. The man was seated by the window, hands folded, satchel at his feet. He looked up as Maigret entered, but didn't speak. Maigret sat opposite him. Neither man moved. "You came to speak," Maigret said. Finally the man nodded. "Yes, but not with you." Then with her, with him. Maigret waited. "I've written him a letter," the man said, nudging the satchel slightly with his foot. "It says what I couldn't say before." Maigret leaned back. "And you believe he'll read it?" "I think he has to." Silence. "And what do you want from this?" Maigret asked softly. The man looked out the window. "To leave it behind. That's all. I'm not here to destroy him. I'm here to let go." It was said plainly, and Maigret believed him. "You loved him," he said. The man nodded once. A long time ago, the room was very quiet. Maigret felt, rather than saw, Louise standing in the doorway behind him. "I thought I could forget," the man continued. "I tried. But when I heard he was here, in the church, giving mass, pretending I had to know if he remembered, if any of it had been real. And has he answered? No. But he saw me, and I saw him. That was enough." Maigret nodded, rising slowly. "I won't stop you," he said. "But you know you've shaken him. Perhaps more than you intended." The man looked down at his hands. That wasn't the plan. Plans, Maigret thought, rarely survived contact with the past. He stepped into the hallway. Louise followed. Will you take the letter to him? She asked. Maigret looked at her. If you want me to? She hesitated. He won't destroy it. He's not like that. No, Maigret agreed. But he may not answer. That's all right, she said. Some things aren't written for replies. She handed him the letter, sealed in a plain envelope, unmarked. He slipped it into his coat. Outside the street was still dark. The wind had picked up again, and the lamp above the old tailor's shop flickered faintly, as if unsure whether to keep burning. Maigret walked back toward the metro, the envelope pressing lightly against his chest, like a heartbeat not his. He didn't know what the letter said. He didn't need to. Some truths were not for police reports. Some were simply meant to be carried. On Sunday morning, Maigret did not go into the office. He rose late, the sky outside the window still colourless and cold. Madame Maigret, already dressed, had gone to the bakery for fresh bread. A pot of coffee waited on the stove. The flat smelled of warm milk and winter. He sat at the table in his dressing gown, pipe in hand, but again he did not light it. His thoughts kept circling round the envelope folded neatly in his inside pocket, the one he had not opened and would not open. It lay beside his wallet, lighter than paper ought to be, and yet heavier than anything else he carried. He's still at the church? Madame Maigret asked when she returned, sliding the morning paper onto the table beside his cup. No. He replied after a moment. He's gone. Where? Maigret shrugged. The sacristan didn't know. He left word with no return date, just that he needed solitude. She nodded and began slicing the bread. He did not tell her about the letter, or the man in the thin coat, or the woman who watched over them, both with a kind of exhausted grace. He didn't need to. She already sensed it. That was how it often was between them, as it was between people who had spent a lifetime understanding, without being told. After breakfast, he dressed slowly, then took the metro to Montmartre, to the address Janvier had found scratched in the margin of a church bulletin, the last known residence of Father Clement's sister, a woman named Matilda Granger. The building was one of those tall, narrow ones with rusting balconies and plaster peeled at the edges. No concierge, just a row of tarnished buzzers, some without names. Maigret pressed the one marked Granger M. It buzzed back weakly. On the third floor, a door opened before he could knock. The woman standing there wore a wool dress and thick glasses, her hair tucked back tightly. She had the face of someone who did not expect visits and did not desire them. Yes. I'm Maigret, Chief Inspector. I'd like to speak to you about your brother Clement. Her eyes narrowed faintly. I don't speak to reporters. I'm not one. Are you investigating him? No, Maigret said. I'm following something that has no name. Something in that seemed to soften her. Not much, but enough. She opened the door wider. Come in. The apartment smelled of lavender and stove gas. Lace curtains, framed religious prints, a crucifix. By the door. Maigret took the offered chair, stiff-backed to near a low table covered in doilies and a dish of licorice pastilles. You said you're not investigating, she said. Then why are you here? I believe your brother is in pain. She folded her hands over her lap. He's a priest. It comes with the work. Not that kind. Now her expression changed, just slightly. She looked toward the corner of the room, where a narrow bookcase held family photographs and a dried bouquet. People forget, she said, that priests are men, that they had lives before. I haven't forgotten. She leaned back. You Want to know about Armand? Megret didn't flinch. That's the man's name. She nodded. Armand DeVoe. They knew each other in 41, in Lyon. It was the war, and everyone was pretending to be someone, and your brother. He was in T. Father Clement, then. He was just Lucien, and Lucien was not yet what he would become. Were they lovers? She didn't answer immediately, but her silence was louder than any confirmation. I told him, she said finally, that he didn't have to run from it, but he couldn't stay. Not then. Not with the way people looked at them. And so he left. Entered seminary. Changed his name. That was his solution. And Armand, he wrote, once. A letter full of hurt. But Lucien never answered. Megret exhaled slowly. Now he's come back. Mathilda's hands tightened in her lap. Yes, and Lucien is afraid, not of the man, of what he did, of what he didn't do. Megret nodded, standing slowly. He left a letter with someone else, a woman. I think she's watched over both of them for longer than either of them realized. Mathilda stood as well, her voice quieter now. You said this isn't an investigation. It isn't. Then what is it? Megret hesitated. It's an ache, he said at last, and sometimes ache is all that remains. By mid-afternoon, the wind had shifted. It was colder now, biting through even Megret's heavy wool coat. He walked. Not to the office, but to a small boarding house on the Rue du Renard, one of those forgotten places with chipped paint and windows that didn't close properly. He had an instinct, it paid off. The woman at the front desk, a matron with wiry hair and yellowed fingernails, confirmed it. Yes, a man like that's staying here. Quiet, keeps to himself. Took the attic room. Is he there now? She sniffed. He hasn't left today. You can go up if you want, but knock first. He gives the impression of being delicate. Megret climbed the stairs. Each landing creaked underfoot. The attic. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked softly. No answer. He pushed it open. Armand was sitting at the window, his coat still on, arms crossed as though to warm himself. On the sill beside him sat a cup of tea gone cold. He looked up slowly, I thought. You might come, he said. I've brought the letter, Megret said, pulling it from his coat. It's not opened. Armand took it. His fingers trembled slightly, but he made no move to tear the seal. I won't read it yet, he said. Not until I'm sure I want to know. Megret nodded. He stepped inside but didn't sit. He left the church, Armand said suddenly. Did they tell you? Yes. Then it worked. I disturbed the illusion. That's what I came for, isn't it? I don't think so, Megret said. I think you came to be seen. Armand smiled faintly, a real smile this time, sad but honest. Maybe, he whispered. Megret looked around the room, bare, aside from a bed, a coat stand, and a small suitcase. There was no running water on this floor, only a wash basin in the hall. What will you do now? He asked. I haven't decided. For now, I'll sit, think, try to forgive myself. Megret turned toward the door. Do you think he'll forgive you? I think, Armand said quietly, he already has. Megret stepped into the corridor. The letter was delivered. The rest, as it always was for the people to decide. He returned to the street just as the wind picked up again, blowing leaves down the narrow lane and into the gutters. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 5 times. Not Santastosh, smaller, more local. Maigret did not look back. Some stories didn't end with answers. Some simply stopped where the ache no longer hurt to touch. Monday came with a bitter cold that stiffened the air, even indoors. The heat inside the Quai des Orfèvres radiated in patches, coming and going with a kind of bureaucratic whim. Some offices were warm as kitchens, others felt like cellars. Maigret's, as usual, was somewhere in between. He arrived late, which no one commented on, and said little throughout the morning. He sat with his coat draped over his shoulders, pipe unlit in his mouth, staring at the top right corner of his blotter as if it were the source of all human mystery. It was Janvier who broke the silence. "There's word from the seminary in Ivry, someone matching Father Clement's description checked in Saturday night. Asked for solitude and was granted a guest cell." Maigret looked up slowly, alone, completely. Did he give a name? No. But the secretary there, an old abbé, recognized him from his younger days. Apparently, he studied there briefly before moving to the diocesan seminary in Orleans. Left before taking vows, Maigret nodded. That was before the war, exactly 38 or 39. Maigret said nothing more. He reached for his teacup, sipped once, and grimaced. Cold. Janvier hovered for a moment. "Is there anything to do, Chief?" "Nothing at all," Maigret murmured. "That's the whole point." Janvier left him to his silence. Later that afternoon, Maigret returned to Saint-Eustache. The walk from Châtelet was familiar now, not just in direction, but in feeling. Each step toward the church brought with it a sense of deepening quiet, as though the noise of the city receded just enough to let subtler things be heard. The drip of gutters, the shuffle of a man wiping fog from a bakery window, the creak of shutters closing early. Inside the church, it was warmer than expected. A single space heater buzzed near the front pews, battling the cold with low, mechanical stubbornness. The candles burned low. A nun dusted near the altar, barely glancing up as he entered. The sacristan greeted him with a nod. "No news," he said quietly. "We don't know when he'll be back." "Who's handling services?" "Father Bellin, the young one." Maigret nodded. He stepped to the side, where a rack of candles waited beside a worn copper box for coins. He dropped in a 5-franc piece and lit one of the thinner votives, not the tall, fancy ones reserved for the blessed or the bold. Just a small flame. He didn't say a prayer. That wasn't his way. He stood, instead, letting the warmth of the flame touch his hand, and thought of the letter in Armand's coat pocket, unopened. He wondered if it ever would be. Behind him, quiet, footsteps approached. He turned slightly, expecting perhaps the nun or Bellin. Instead, it was Louise Vernet. She wore the same grey coat, but something in her face had changed. Not softened. It had never been hard. But the tension in her jaw was gone, the quiet held breath of someone long waiting. "You didn't expect me?" she asked. "I didn't expect anything," Maigret replied. She stepped beside him. Together they watched the flicker of the small flame. "Have you seen him?" she asked. "Armand," she nodded. Double quotes, "Yes." "Is he well?" "He's surviving." She exhaled slowly. "That's something. Have you spoken to Clement since?" She shook her head. "I don't think he'll come back. Not to the church. He's at a seminary outside Paris. Reflecting, she repeated, almost to herself. "Is that what you call it?" Maigret didn't answer. Not directly. It's what people do when they're not ready. To name something. She looked at him now, her face worn but steady. He hurt him, you know, Armand, but not by loving him, by walking away. Maigret nodded. I know. Did you ever want to walk away from something? He thought for a moment. Yes, once, but I didn't. I stayed. And did it matter? He looked again at the candle. Not to anyone else, but to me, yes. They stood like that for some time. Strangers in silence. The church dimming as afternoon leaned toward dusk. At last, she said, I'll go visit him. In Ivry, you think he'll receive you? I think he'll try. She turned to leave, then paused. Thank you, Inspector, for not asking questions. You didn't need answers to. Maigret gave a small nod. Some things only get smaller the more you talk about them. She smiled faintly, then stepped out into the fading light. That night, back in his apartment, Maigret sat with his slippers on and a newspaper unopened on his lap. Madame Maigret worked on a crossword puzzle, glasses perched low on her nose. You're not restless anymore, she said quietly. No, he replied, just tired. You finished it. There was nothing to finish. She looked at him over her glasses. That's not like you. He reached for his pipe, lit it slowly. The smoke curled in the warm air of the living room. There was no crime, he said, only a sadness that finally wanted to be seen. She folded the paper. And did it help? I think so, he said. No one confessed. No one was arrested, but something was spoken, even if only in silence. He puffed once, a kind of justice. They sat that way a long time. Outside, the city moved on without them. Traffic, laughter, distant shouting. But inside the flat, everything was still. Maigret looked out the window. Rain was starting again, delicate at first, brushing the pane. Like breath, he wondered where Armand was now, whether he'd opened the letter, whether it had said what needed to be said. He'd never ask. Some answers belong to the people who carry them, and some flames, like the one he'd lit that afternoon, burn only for the ones who will never see them. By Tuesday morning, Paris had frozen. A thin sheen of ice glazed the gutters and pavements. People walked hunched into their coats, their breath forming ghosts ahead of them. On the Quai des Orfèvres, the windows rattled slightly each time the wind turned from the river. And inside the corridors of the police headquarters, everyone moved slower, boots louder on the stone floors, voices muffled by layers of wool. Maigret arrived just before 9, coat collar up, scarf wet from the walk across Pont Saint-Michel. He stood at the coat rack a moment longer than usual, brushing flakes of snow from his shoulders, then moved wordlessly to his office. He set his pipe on the desk, filled it and didn't light it. Janvier came in with a sheaf of reports and set them down with a little more force than needed, not to make a point, but to be noticed. Nothing urgent, he said. Maigret glanced at the top sheet. Nothing ever is. Janvier hesitated at the door. Any word from Batignolles? None. And the priest Maigret shook his head. Still, at Ivry, if he's spoken to anyone, it wasn't us. Janvier shifted his weight, clearly holding something in. You're sure there's nothing we should? No, Maigret said, not unkindly, I'm sure. Janvier nodded and left. It had been nearly a week since Maigret first sat across from Father Bellon in that quiet interview room, a week since a woman in grey gloves walked into Saint-Eustache and bent the silence around her presence, since a long shadow in a thin coat reappeared from a past too quietly buried. There had been no crime, no charges, nothing to report. Still, something had happened, and Maigret, for all his certainty, could feel the weight of it. Like smoke caught in the lungs long after the fire had gone out. At mid-morning, Megret stepped out for air. He walked down the steps, into the wind, and turned toward the river. The quay was mostly empty, save for a bookseller arranging damp volumes on his stall and a woman in a red beret feeding pigeons as if it was spring. The Seine moved slowly, clogged with leaves, its surface pewter under the pale sky. He lit his pipe finally, and stood looking across to the Isle de la Cite, where the towers of Notre Dame rose like stone sentinels. He thought about the young priest, Bellin now saying mass to half-empty pews, fumbling perhaps, trying too hard to project calm. He thought about Armand in his attic room in the Rue du Renard, and the envelope Megret had passed him without reading. He wondered again if it had been opened, and he thought about Clement Lucien alone at the seminary, walking its walled garden in silence, a man not so much punished as exiled from his own identity, not by the church, not by Armand, but by himself. The bell of Saint Eustache rang 11. Megret turned away from the river and made his way slowly toward the church. Inside, it was warmer than the street, but not by much. A few people sat scattered in the pews, heads bowed more from cold than devotion. A woman murmured her rosary. Someone else coughed near the back. The heater buzzed weakly, struggling against the stone. Megret stood near the candles again, but he didn't light one this time. Father Bellin appeared from the side chapel, his steps careful, his cassock sweeping slightly as he walked. He looked thinner, or perhaps simply more drawn. The past week had aged him. "Inspector," he said, approaching, "I didn't expect to see you again." "I don't expect myself," Megret said. They stood in silence a moment. Then Bellin added, "He wrote me a letter, Father Clement. It arrived this morning." Megret looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. Bellin reached into his coat and withdrew a folded page, handled but not yet creased. "He asked me to read it aloud to the congregation this Sunday, during the homily. What does it say? He's resigning, officially. He says the burden is no longer one he can carry with grace, that he's grateful but finished." Megret nodded slowly. He didn't mention the man. "No," Bellin said, "only guilt and peace." As though the two had finally met. Megret thought about that for a moment. Then, quietly, "He's not coming back. I know, and the woman. She came to light a candle yesterday. Didn't speak, but I think she knew before any of us." Megret turned toward the altar. "This place feels different now. It's quieter, quieter than a church should be, quieter than it was with him in it." Megret exhaled through his nose. The smoke from his pipe rose in a lazy spiral toward the vaulted ceiling. "People think silence is holy," he said, "but sometimes it's only fear." Bellin looked at him, startled. Megret didn't elaborate. He stepped back from the candles and made his way toward the side door. As he passed the rack of leaflets near the entrance, one slipped from the stack and drifted to the floor. He bent, picked it up, and glanced at it. Absent, lie. It was for a music recital next Thursday, batch. Organ only. Donations welcome. The silence, then, would be filled. Outside, the wind had calmed. The sky remained low, thick with cloud, but the snow had stopped. He walked the Rue Montorgueil slowly, boots scuffing the grit along the curb, and stopped for a moment outside a flower stall where yellow tulips had begun to appear despite the frost. He didn't buy any. Back at the office, Janvier raised an eyebrow as Megret re-entered. "Anything?" Nothing, Megret said. He shed his coat, hung it slowly, and returned to his desk. Sat, picked up the same dossier he'd held Friday, and opened it to the same page. He read 3 lines. Closed it. You know, he said aloud, though not to anyone in particular, people are always looking for something to blame. A person, a moment, a mistake. Genevieve glanced up from his typing. But most of the time, Megret continued, they just want to be seen. Not judged, not forgiven, just seen. Genevieve hesitated. You think that's what this was? I think that's what most things are. Genevieve considered that, then returned to his report. Outside the window, the day leaned toward evening, even though it wasn't yet 3. Winter did that, shortened the light, stretched the dark, gave more time for people to sit alone and think about what they'd left behind. Mag reached for his pipe again, lit it without ceremony, and leaned back. There would be no resolution, no arrest, no neat file stamped and filed away. Just a man who loved, and a man who left, and a woman who stayed. 3 stories with no conclusion, except that one could now sleep. Another could finally stop waiting. And the third had chosen solitude as a kind of peace. The mystery was never how it ended. It was why it hurt so long. The week turned, Wednesday. Arrived under a pale sun that threatened warmth but delivered none. The streets were still slick with frost in the shaded places, and even the waiters at the cafes worked with their shoulders hunched high, pouring coffee with fingers that never quite left their gloves. Megret took his coffee inside that morning, at the Brasserie Dauphine, seated in the corner beneath the cracked mirror. It was one of the few places left where he could sit without being spoken to. The waiter knew his rhythm. Coffee first, pipe afterward, no newsprint, no chit-chat. He sipped slowly, not thinking in words, but in a kind of measured mood, like water, settling in a glass dot. He had not visited Armand again, nor Louise, nor had he returned to Evry. Whatever needed to pass between those 3 had already done so in letters, in gestures, in silences carefully observed. His part was finished, yet the weight of the case, if one could call it that, lingered in him. He was used to loose ends, a killer who refused to confess, a widow who looked too serene. But this was different. It hadn't unraveled, it had settled, like silt at the bottom of a river. Quiet, but never entirely still. At 11, he returned to the office. Genevieve was gone for the day, out interviewing witnesses in an unrelated theft, and the halls of the quay were hushed, as though under quarantine. A single envelope waited on Megret's desk. No address, just his name, written in neat, blocky handwriting. He opened it without hurry. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The writing was unfamiliar but deliberate. Inspector, I read the letter. I read it twice. Then I burned it. I do not regret that. Some things aren't meant to be kept. She was right, Louise. She said once that I would never stop running until someone caught up to me. I thought she meant the law, but she meant the truth. You didn't ask me to explain. That's why I'm writing now. It wasn't shame that drove me away. Not at first. It was fear of loving something too much. And then it became shame, the kind that hardens over time until it's all that's left. I built the priesthood like a wall around it. Armand saw through it. Louise, too. You did as well. I have resigned from the church, not in disgrace, simply in honesty. Thank you for not chasing me. It made it easier to stop. Lucien Clement Maigret folded the letter and set it in the drawer of his desk. He didn't lock it. That afternoon, he walked again to Saint-Eustache. It had become a habit by now, not investigatory, but almost ritualistic. Like returning to the scene of a thought. The church was quiet as always, though warmer than it had been. Belen was at the altar, adjusting candles with slow, practiced hands. When he saw Maigret, he gave a slight nod, but didn't approach. Maigret wandered the side aisles. There was no reason now, no pressing question to be answered. He simply let the space move around him, the echo of shoes on old stone, the faint smell of wax and wood polish, the hush of people whispering to themselves. He stopped in the chapel of St. Joseph, a space so small most visitors missed it entirely. There, tucked against the wall, was a statue of the saint, a carpenter's tools at his feet. Eyes lifted, not to heaven, but to the faces of those who passed. Maigret lit a candle. He didn't think of Lucien, or Armand, or Louise. He thought of how many people carried truths too soft for law, too private for confession. People whose pain left no trace but a subtle silence in a room. People for whom justice was simply the ability to move forward without being seen as something they were not. The flame flickered, catching on the wick. A modest light, struggling at first, then steadying. Behind him, a voice murmured, not a prayer, not addressed to him, just a man muttering thanks under his breath. The ordinary grace of survival. Maigret stepped back. Let the flame alone. The next morning, a postcard arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres. It was addressed to Maigret, though unsigned. The image on the front was a photograph of a monastery garden in winter, the trees bare, the paths cleanly swept. On the back, in small, careful handwriting, I have decided not to become anything new. I will just be, and for now, that is enough. No name, but Maigret knew the hand. He placed the card beside the folded letter in his drawer, then reached for his coat. Janvier poked his head in as he was rising. "Where to, Chief?" Maigret smiled. Faintly. "Nowhere," he said. "I thought I'd just walk." And so he did. Not to Batignolles, not to the seminary, not to Saint-Eustache. He walked the city with no case in his pocket, no warrant in his hand. He passed women sweeping steps, dogs trotting beside newspaper boys, bakers dusting flour from their aprons. All of it unremarkable. All of it, somehow, healing. By the time he reached the Calf du Centre on Rue Rambateau, the sun had returned. Weak, but warm enough to catch on the rim of a coffee cup. He took a table outside, ordered a beer, and watched. The street, not for crime, not for anyone, just to watch, just to be.